Hello and good day, welcome back. This is a video in which I will go over the tempi that Bach used in his music based on a mathematical tempo matrix. Now this might seem very heady, very mathematical, but in my last video, if you haven't seen it yet, you need to view that first. This is a whole series of videos on Bach's tempo practices. In the last video that I made a point of, I read out of Christoph Wolff's book here, Johann Sebastian Bach, The Learned Musician, published in 2000, I believe. I was reading from page 4 here. One of the main theses that Professor Wolff makes in the first chapter is that Bach considered himself to be like a musical scientist or a musical scholar who produced works of musical science. I quote Professor Wolff here, stripping the phrase of the conventional formalities and courtly protocol, the statement reveals what this work was to represent. He's talking about the B minor Mass, his achievements in the science of music. He was not a musicant, that is a German word for just a musician, but rather someone who held the directorship of music in Leipzig's two principal churches. Bach considered himself a musical scholar producing works of musical science. And before this, Wolff points out that Bach did not like to be called a musician or a composer. He didn't like those terms. He considered himself to be a musical scholar who produced works of musical science. So I'll just say musical scientist. That's my term that I'm taking from this. And in my discovery way back in 1992, when I explained in the last video, I came up with this system that I believe that Bach used in his music. I explain using a couple pieces, a couple of preludes and fugues, how it was very common practice for Bach to link two pieces together, such as a prelude and a fugue, or an aria and a chorus from a cantata, or perhaps two movements from a chamber work, two or even more movements from a chamber work, and he linked those together and unified them with either a common or a related duration, such as like 2 minutes and 3 minutes. That would be a 2 to 3 ratio, or whatever. It doesn't have to be a perfect number. It could be just whatever duration, like the first prelude and fugue. And the prelude is a little faster than the fugue is a little slower, and by doing that, they are unified by one duration, which is a 1-to-1 ratio. Then you also have 2 to 3 ratios. So I explained in the last video that the most common relationships in Bach's music, based on my research, and I researched this for about 10 years, for a good 10 years I was doing this. So I know what I'm talking about. I counted every single measure in all of Bach's works and analyzed relationships between measures and compared those with possible tempi, the possible tempos at which are good to perform those works. And I discovered something pretty shocking, that Bach was, I think, a musical architect, which is synonymous with like a musical scientist, who sought either 1-to-1, 2-to-3, or 1-to-2 duration ratios between movements. Have you ever noticed that Bach almost never composed just single movements? He didn't compose like a prelude. He composed a prelude and a fugue for organ or keyboard. He didn't compose just an aria, but he usually had an aria followed by a chorus, or a chorus followed by an aria, or perhaps 3 in a row. Perhaps he'd have an aria and a chorus and then another aria. So there could be, in the cantatas, when we get to those eventually, there could be even 3-way relationships between those, like a relationship between the first 2 and then a relationship between the second two. So what Bach did was that he was a musical architect. He basically composed backwards. So the only way that this is achievable is if you know your tempi beforehand. You know the tempo of the movement that you're going to compose. You know the time signature, of course, so you know the tempo and the time signature, which allows you, the composer, in this case Bach, to figure out how many measures is the target number of measures to achieve whatever duration he was shooting for. And so if you have a prelude and fugue, for example, you know, he may have composed the prelude first. For example, the C sharp minor prelude, which I went over in the last video, let's assume he composed that first. He hit 39 measures on that. Then he figured, well, the fugue is going to be the same quarter note speed as the prelude, and it's in 2/2, so in order to achieve a 1-to-2 ratio between those, to make the fugue 2 times longer than the prelude, I have to achieve 117 measures. So 39 times 3 is 117. Well, he got very close. He got 115. Most of the time, Bach didn't hit these 100% accurately. They're usually 1 or 2 measures off. But when you analyze his music and the numbers of measures in his music and possible tempi, that it is really obvious to see that Bach did these things. They were not coincidental, they were not arbitrary, but they were planned. Bach was a musical architect. So here's the next thing, is this tempo matrix. In order to do what Bach did and to link 2 movements together by a common duration, or a duration that's related, either 1-to-1, 2-to-3, or 1-to-2. The only way Bach could have done that is he had to have known his tempi in beats per minute. He had to have known that. So I think that Bach had a system, some sort of a system. He had default tempi for each sort of tempo style. So he had a default kind of largo tempo. He had a default adagio tempo. He had a default andante tempo. He had a default more of a moderate, what we would call moderato. He didn't use the word moderato much, but a default moderato tempo, and then a default allegro tempo, and a default presto tempo. So when you analyze Bach's works, you see that there are about a dozen different tempo families that fit into his music. So it's not as easy as just playing everything at the same tempo or something like that some people propose, but it's a little more complicated than that. There are families of tempi that are all related some way. So if you go to BachScholar.com, I have a link below this video, and you click on the link that says Unified Theory of Tempo Relativity. Okay, this is a paper that I wrote in 1992. I took it off the site, and then I have recently put it back on there. If you want to get into the technicalities of how I came up with these numbers, you can read that article. I would highly recommend that article as preparation for this and understanding more about how we come up with these numbers. So these are my numbers, yes, but I believe they were also Bach's numbers. Anyone can come up with these numbers. All you need is a little bit of math skills, and you can come up with these numbers. So first and foremost, if Bach knew his tempi in beats per minute and planned them, they would have to be integers or whole numbers. No one works with fractional values. You don't see anywhere when you have a book of music and there's a metronome suggestion there, it never says 71.3. It will say 72. It never says 60.8. It will say like 60 or whatever. So the first thing we have to realize is that if Bach was a musical scientist and a musical architect, then and if he planned his durations to be related, as explained in the previous video, then he must have known his tempi and beats per minute. Now we can go a step further. If he knew his tempos and beats per minute, they had to have been integers or whole numbers. So we can't deal with fractions. So this is a matrix of tempi that I derived way back in 1992 based on that article. And that article, the Unified Theory of Tempo Relativity, doesn't really have anything to do with Bach. It's just an abstract theory in itself, and it explains how I got these numbers. Realize this, that all of these numbers in the matrix are whole numbers, except this oddball right here, 31.5. With the exception of this here, you have every number is a whole number or an integer. That's very important because this is the only matrix of numbers that can be derived that have an equal gradation of acceleration. That this is the only matrix that can be derived. This is a mathematically correct tempo matrix, the only one in existence. This is the one. This is the best tempo matrix in existence. And this, like I said, it doesn't have anything to do with Bach. This is just abstract mathematics right here. So you have columns. You have one note. This is what I call a fastest common note value, or what I call an FCNV, a fastest common note value. All rows are unified by a fastest common note value, or FCNV. And each row represents a family of equal tempi unified by a fastest common note value. So you can see that each row, 168, 84, 56, 42, 28, 21, those are all equal tempi. They're equal in terms of the fastest common note value here. So if you take this, if you take one note at 168 beats per minute, and then you group two of them together, then the resulting beat of those two notes is 84. It's simply half of 168. If you take three of these and group all three of those together, then it results in 56. If you group them by fours in quadruplets, you get 42, sextuplet 28, octuplet 21. I'm omitting the fives and sevens, quintuplets and septuplets, because those aren't found very often in music. I'm just dealing with the most common divisions of notes. So you can see that the fastest common note value here goes down the line and accelerates. It goes from 168, 192, 216, 252, 288, 336, 384, 432, 504, 576. Now if you take each one of those and you subject it to this formula here, you'll get these numbers. So each of the columns is accelerating to the next integer in that series, like this. This is what I think they would call in the 20th century. 20th century music, there was a term for this that composers used a lot. For example, Elliott Carter's music was full of it. It's called metric modulation. So each one of, if you look at this one note grouped as twos, but it's equal by fastest note, and then that's equal by fastest note, that's equal by fastest note, so forth, so forth. That's what's known as metric modulation. And Bach obviously used metric modulation in his music between pieces. He didn't use it like Elliott Carter did, like many times in one movement. But Bach did it. He didn't call it metric modulation. He didn't know what that was probably, but he realized that being the musical scientist that Bach was, it's obvious that he realized this theory or this unified tempo theory that anyone could come up with these integers. So if you take this matrix, as we see here, this matrix is the only tempi that exist in Bach's music. These are, if Bach was really a musical scientist, if he was really a musical architect and he did these things that I claim in the previous video, if that's true, then this has to be true, because this is the only matrix of whole numbers or integers that can be derived that have there's no decimals anywhere except this oddball here. That's not even that important. All of the main tempi that Bach used in his music can be found here somewhere. So if you're talking about, let's take the most common situation here of 4 notes. Let's take the Prelude in C major from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. You're in 4/4 time and you have 16th notes. So that would be like this. We would just put another line there and make them 16th notes. So we have a choice. If you had to locate or choose or determine the most likely tempo that Bach planned for that prelude, you would look in this column here, because this is the one with quadruplets in it. So the quarter note of the Prelude in C major is somewhere here. It's somewhere in those numbers. Now you can narrow that down by process of elimination. You can eliminate the really fast ones. You can eliminate the really slow ones, I guess, and which really leaves you just a few options. I would say I've toyed around with a few tempi, and they're always somewhere around here, either 63 or 72. I think 20 years ago, I thought that prelude that Bach planned 72, and now I'm beginning to think 63 because I have second thoughts about the fugue as well. And the fugue, the tempo of the fugue, if you watched the last video, I talk about how the fugue, the C major fugue, is a little slower than the prelude. And then if you do that, you make them equal durations, which I believe Bach planned. Then let's say this: if the prelude is 63 beats per minute, which I think is a very good musical speed for it. I think that's the perfect speed. Like I said, 20 years ago, I thought it was 72, but now I'm beginning to think that's a little too fast since my theory has evolved a little bit. So let's say 63 for the prelude, C major prelude. And if you just do a little math, you'll see, if you plug in the numbers, remember the fugue had 27 measures of 4/4 time. So if you just do the math, get a calculator and figure it out, you'll see that if the tempo of the prelude is 63, but first of all, let's go back. If Bach planned that prelude and fugue to have the same duration, and if we choose this for the prelude, then the fugue has to be this speed, or vice versa, if you do the fugue first and then figure out the prelude. So if then, you're really limited with these. Now, 20 years ago, as I said, or even less than 20 years ago, I believe the prelude was 72 and the fugue was 54. But like I said, my theory has evolved over the years. It sort of has settled a little bit over the years. I still stand by these tempi, but I think I'm modifying some of them, but the relationships are usually all the same. So today in 2021, October of 2021, as I make this video, I can be certain, pretty certain actually very certain, that if Bach were to be resurrected today and come and tell us all about his planning of durations, I am willing to bet my money that the Prelude is 63 and the Fugue is 48. That makes both about 2 minutes and 15 seconds, give or take a couple seconds. So it's really interesting when you apply this to the music. Now let's look at the Prelude and Fugue in C sharp minor that I went over in the last video. Remember, the Prelude has 39 measures of 6/4 and the Fugue has 115 measures of 2/2. So the Prelude, dun 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 dun. The Prelude actually goes like this, but da 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 da. Those are like duplets. Those are duplets. I mean, they are quadruplets if you take. No, they're not really, because it's in 6/4. So it's really in groups of 2. So you have, so the quarter note tempo of the C sharp minor Prelude is somewhere here in this column here, under the duplets. And I've gravitated towards just a slightly slower speed, as I mentioned yesterday in my video. I believe that this is the best tempo for the Prelude, 96 beats per quarter note. I used to think it was 108. I've also, in this Prelude and Fugue, I've just slowed it down slightly because I think 108 is just a tad fast. I had my reasons for 108 like 20 or 30 years ago, or almost 30, 25 years ago. But I'm beginning to think now, as the tempo, as my theory is settling a little bit, I'm beginning to think that Prelude is best at 96. So here's our formula. If Bach intended that Prelude and Fugue to have a 1:2 duration ratio, and if the Prelude is this tempo, then the Fugue must be that tempo per half note. Remember that the quarter notes are equal in that Prelude and Fugue. So the tempo of the Fugue is either, if you're thinking of it as quarter notes, it would be 96, or if you think of it in half notes, which is probably the best thing to do, it's 48. So if you take, and that's a little slower than most people play it, but the more I play it at 48, the more I think that's the correct tempo. It really helps to bring out the expression. And remember that this is an emulation of Renaissance vocal music, sacred vocal music, that is almost always slow in nature. So this C sharp minor Fugue from Book 1, 48, the Prelude, 96. If you play it at those speeds, the quarter notes remain equal, and there's a 1:2 ratio. Not only that, but if you do further research into the numbers of measures, you'll discover that it's very close. The Fugue, if played at this tempo, the Fugue is very close to 5 minutes, which leads me to believe that perhaps in his first drafting of that Prelude and Fugue, Bach, I think, had an ideal of a 5-minute Fugue with a 2.5-minute Prelude. And it's pretty close to that. It's pretty close. It's actually a little less. It's a couple measures less than that for each piece. But I do believe that Bach had an ideal when he planned it, like an architect would plan the rooms, 2 rooms in a house or building. Bach, I think, planned that Prelude to last 2.5 minutes and that Fugue to last 5 minutes. But when he composed the Prelude, assuming that he did that first, he was a little short because he would have had to have 1 more measure actually just one. So he was one measure off from a perfect 2.5-minute prelude. So instead of 40 measures, he hit 39. And then because he hit 39, when he composed the fugue, he tried to cut it a little short, maybe, of the ideal of 120, because it would have been 120 measures. So I believe in Bach's initial drafting of the C-sharp minor prelude and fugue, I think it's pretty obvious that he planned 40 measures for the prelude and 120 measures for the fugue. And he was short a little bit on the prelude by 1 measure, and then he still wanted to make them equal, so he deliberately cut the fugue a few measures short. It's really amazing when you think about it, about how close Bach was to attaining a perfect 1-to-2 duration ratio. But nevertheless, quarter note in the prelude, half note in the fugue, and it has a 1-to-2 duration ratio. It's really amazing to think that in all of Bach's works, all of his keyboard works, all of his organ works, all of his cantatas, everything Bach composed, their tempi can be found in this matrix. I guarantee this. I swear by this. I put all my money on this, and I think that that's going to help us as performers figure out, or at least get closer to the tempi that Bach really wanted for his music, which oftentimes is much different than the way you hear them performed today. So thank you for joining me today, and stay tuned for more videos like this in the series. Write these numbers down, experiment with them a little bit, and see how you like them. Until we meet again.